The disappearing town.
The car rumbled down the narrow, winding road as the four friends exchanged idle conversation. The town of Barrows Hollow loomed just a few miles ahead, a place they had all grown up in but had left behind years ago. Now, their return was shrouded in a haze of nostalgia and unease. The winding road carved through dense woods, and the looming canopy above blocked out much of the late afternoon sun, casting the road in shadows. "I still can't believe we all agreed to this," Jake said from the driver's seat, his fingers tapping the steering wheel nervously. "Coming back after so many years feels weird." "Don't be such a baby," Liz, sitting in the passenger seat, rolled her eyes. "It'll be fun. Just a quick trip down memory lane. See what's changed, maybe hit up a few old spots." In the back, Kara and Evan exchanged a glance. Both of them had felt uneasy about this reunion ever since Liz had brought it up. Their childhood town wasn't a place they had left willingly. It was a town that seemed to cling to your soul in unsettling ways. "I don't know," Kara said quietly. "Doesn't it feel strange to anyone else? We've been gone for so long, and no one ever talks about Barrows Hollow anymore." "It's not like anyone ever did," Evan added. "The place is a ghost town. People left for better opportunities, and we all moved on. It happens." "But why did everyone leave?" Kara asked. It felt so sudden, like one day the town was thriving, and the next it was empty. Liz scoffed. "It's not that deep. Small towns like Barrows Hollow fade all the time. It was bound to happen." Still, despite Liz's dismissal, an air of unease settled over the group as the car made its final turn onto the main road that led into town. The trees cleared, revealing the familiar sight of the once bustling center of Barrows Hollow. But something was wrong. The streets were empty, not just quiet, but eerily deserted. "Where is everyone?" Jake muttered under his breath as the car rolled slowly down the street. Barrows Hollow had never been a large town, but even on a lazy summer afternoon, there had always been people, residents sitting on their porches, children playing in the park, shop owners tending to their stores. Now, it looked frozen in time, as if the whole place had been abandoned mid-breath. The four friends fell silent as they took in the scene. Buildings stood still and silent, their windows dark and empty. The local diner where they had once gathered after school was closed, its neon sign flickering faintly. No cars lined the streets. No birds chirped. The only sound was the soft rumble of the car's engine as they moved deeper into the town. "Maybe they are all inside," Evan suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. Jake pulled the car over in front of the town's old general store. The sight of it brought back a flood of memories, hot summer days spent running around the aisles, buying candy and soda, the familiar face of Mr. Harper at the counter. But now, the store looked just as abandoned as the rest of the town. The windows were covered in dust, and the door hung slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze. "This is seriously creepy," Kara said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's no one here. No signs of life at all." Liz, always the boldest of the group, unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed open the car door. "Come on, let's just look around for a bit. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Maybe it's a Sunday, and everyone's out at the lake or something." The others reluctantly followed her lead, stepping out of the car and into the unsettling stillness. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and disuse. The town, once familiar and alive, now felt foreign, like a forgotten relic from a dream. Jake, always the most cautious, glanced up at the sky. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty streets. "We shouldn't stay too long," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "This place is giving me the creeps." Liz shot him a look. "Relax, we're just checking it out. We'll head back before it gets too dark." They began walking down the main street, their footsteps the only sound breaking the eerie silence. Every building they passed was the same, abandoned, empty, as though the people of Barrows Hollow had simply vanished one day, leaving everything behind. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of a town that had gradually faded away. It was as if everyone had just up and disappeared all at once. As they approached the town square, a sense of unease settled deeper into their bones. The fountain, once the centerpiece of the square where kids used to throw coins and make wishes, was dry and cracked. Benches stood empty. The park that had once been filled with the laughter of children now sat eerily quiet, overgrown with weeds. "What the hell happened here?" Evan whispered, his eyes wide as he scanned the desolate scene. "I don't know," Lee said, her earlier bravado faltering, "but it's definitely weird." Kara stopped in front of the old post office, her hand resting on the door. "Do you guys remember when we used to sneak in here after hours?" she asked, her voice tinged with nostalgia. But the moment passed quickly as she looked through the grimy window. "It's just so empty now." Jake, still on edge, glanced nervously around them. We should go. This place isn't right. There's something off about it. Lee shot him an exasperated look. We just got here. Let's at least check out a few more spots. The school's not far from here. Maybe someone's there. With a resigned sigh, the group continued walking, heading toward the familiar building that had once been their school. But as they approached, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The windows were dark, and the doors were slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Looks like we're not getting any answers here either, Evan muttered as they stepped through the doorway. The inside of the school was just as abandoned as the rest of the town, with dust-covered desks and overturned chairs. The familiar halls where they had once spent their days were now silent and oppressive. Catherine, who had been quietly observing the surroundings, suddenly stopped in her tracks. Did anyone else hear that? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The others froze, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but the stillness of the empty school. But then, faintly, they heard it, a whisper, soft and almost indistinct, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Jake's eyes widened in fear. We need to get out of here. But Liz was already moving toward the sound, her curiosity getting the better of her. Come on, let's just see what it is. It's probably just the wind. Against their better judgment, the others followed her as she made her way down the dark hallway, the whisper growing louder with each step. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of voices seemed to fill the space around them. And then they saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the hall, its back turned to them, motionless. Catherine let out a sharp breath. Who is that? She whispered, her voice trembling. No one answered. They all stood frozen, staring at the figure, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. The figure slowly turned to face them. There was no one there, just the fading echo of whispers in the empty halls. The figure had vanished, leaving behind an unsettling silence that seemed to weigh heavily on the group. Liz, for the first time, hesitated, her usual bravado faltering. She stepped back from the dimly lit hallway where the ghostly figure had stood just moments before. What was that? Kara whispered, her voice trembling. She hadn't moved since the figure disappeared, her eyes wide and glued to the spot where it had been. The whispering still echoed faintly in her ears, like a distant conversation she couldn't quite make out. No idea, Evan muttered, his voice barely audible. But I don't think we should stick around to find out. Liz, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine, laughed nervously. It was probably just a trick of the light. This place is falling apart. Who knows what kind of shadows are being cast? Jake, who had been standing near the back of the group, stared at Liz incredulously. A trick of the light? Are you serious, Liz? That was a person. Or something. It wasn't just shadows. Liz opened her mouth to retort but stopped herself. She couldn't deny the strangeness of the situation any longer. The town was deserted. The figure in the hallway had been real, or at least felt real, and the whispering they had heard wasn't something you could just explain away. The group stood there, frozen in place, the eerie quiet of the school wrapping itself around them like a cold blanket. Every instinct told them to leave, but none of them moved. It was as if the very air around them was holding them captive, urging them deeper into the mystery. We need to go, Jake said firmly, breaking the silence. Something is wrong here. Really wrong. This town isn't just empty, it feels off. And that thing we saw, whatever it was, wasn't natural. Liz hesitated. Her curiosity still tugged at her, but the fear in her friends' faces was enough to make her question herself. Fine, let's get out of the school. Maybe we'll get some answers somewhere else in town. They turned to leave, their footsteps echoing down the dusty, abandoned hallway as they made their way back toward the exit. But as they approached the doors, the whispering returned, louder this time, and coming from all directions. It wasn't a single voice but many, overlapping, chaotic, like dozens of people murmuring just beneath the surface of reality. Kara grabbed Evan's arm, her face pale. Do you hear that? Evan nodded, his brow furrowed in confusion. Yeah, it's everywhere. They pushed open the doors and stumbled back out into the fading light of Barrows Hollow. The once familiar streets were now bathed in a strange, unnatural glow as the sun did below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. For a moment, they stood in the middle of the road, unsure of where to go next. The entire town felt like a giant trap, waiting to spring. The whispers were still present, lingering just beyond the edge of their perception, but now something else accompanied them, a strange feeling, like the air itself had become charged with electricity. Let's head back to the car, Jake suggested, his voice tight with anxiety. We'll get out of here, call the police, or someone. This isn't normal. They began walking toward the parked car, but as they neared the spot where they had left it, something even more unsettling caught their attention. The car was gone. What the hell? Evan muttered, his hands going to his hair in frustration. We parked it right here. Lizzie's heart raced as she scanned the street. There was no sign of their car, no tire marks, no indication that it had ever been there. It was as if the car had simply vanished, just like the people of the town. This isn't happening, Kara said, her voice shaking. We're not trapped here, right? Someone's messing with us. They have to be. But deep down, they all knew the truth. There was no one left to play tricks on them. Whatever was happening in Barrows Hollow was something far beyond a prank or a hoax. We need to get out of here, Jake said again, his voice rising in panic. We can't stay. We can't. Before he could finish, the street lights flickered to life, casting the empty town in a harsh, unnatural light. The glow wasn't comforting. If anything, it made the abandoned streets look even more desolate, more eerie. The shadows around the buildings deepened, stretching unnaturally long, like they were reaching out for the group. Without speaking, they all turned and began walking, fast, back toward the town center. The once quiet streets now felt suffocating, the oppressive silence punctuated only by the ever-present whispers that seemed to be growing louder with every step they took. As they passed the diner, Liz glanced at its flickering neon sign. Her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood inside, barely visible through the dusty windows. At first, she thought it was another trick of the light, but no, it was moving, swaying back and forth in a slow, rhythmic motion. It was a woman, standing in the center of the diner, her back turned toward the group. Guys, Liz whispered, pointing toward the window. They all turned to look, and for a moment, no one said anything. The woman in the diner was completely still now, her back rigid, her head tilted slightly to the side as though she were listening for something. Is she real? Kara asked, her voice barely audible. Jake swallowed hard, taking a step back from the window. I don't know, but I don't think we should find out. But before they could move, the woman in the diner turned around slowly. Her face was obscured by the grime on the windows, but her posture was unnatural, stiff. And then, as if sensing their presence, she took a slow, deliberate step toward the window. Lizzie's heart pounded in her chest. We need to go. The others didn't need any further convincing. They turned and bolted, running as fast as they could down the empty street. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, chasing them as they fled through the deserted town. The buildings around them seemed to blur, warping and shifting in the corners of their vision, as though the town itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a wrong move. They didn't stop running until they reached the outskirts of Barrows Hollow, the trees looming ahead like a wall of safety. But as they slowed, gasping for breath, they realized something terrifying. The trees didn't look right either. The road they had come in on was gone. There was no path back to the highway, no way out. Instead, the forest seemed to encircle the town completely, a thick, impenetrable barrier of twisted branches and darkness. Jake stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the wall of trees that now blocked their escape. Where's the road? We didn't come this way, Evan said, shaking his head in disbelief. We didn't. There was a road, Kara cried. I remember it. We all do. Liz turned in circles, scanning the area. But no matter where she looked, the town was surrounded by dense forest. The road had disappeared, swallowed by the strange, unnatural landscape of Barrows Hollow. We're trapped, Liz whispered, her voice trembling. There's no way out. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the trees, seeping through the very air around them. And then, from somewhere deep within the town, they heard it, a low, mournful sound, like the tolling of a distant bell. The sound of the distant bell echoed through the darkened streets of Barrows Hollow, reverberating in the bones of the four friends as they stood at the edge of the forest. The toll was low and haunting, each time a reminder of the inescapable trap they now found themselves in. Liz glanced nervously toward the thick wall of trees, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The road they had come in on was gone, replaced by an impenetrable tangle of woods that stretched endlessly in every direction. There was no way out. What the hell is going on? Kara whispered, clutching Evan's arm as though he were the only solid thing left in the world. Evan, pale and wide-eyed, shook his head slowly. I don't know, but we need to stay together. There has to be a way out of here. We just haven't found it yet. The bell tolled again, its eerie sound rolling across the empty town like a wave. Jake winced, rubbing his ears as though the noise had physically hurt him. That sound, it's coming from the church, isn't it? They all turned to look back toward the heart of the town. Barrows Hollow's old church sat at the far end of Main Street, a crumbling relic from their childhood, with its peeling white paint and sagging steeple. The bell had rung only on rare occasions, usually during town gatherings or funerals. But now, in the silence of the abandoned town, it felt like a summons, a dark, twisted call that demanded their attention. Liz crossed her arms tightly over her chest, glancing between the others. We can't just stand here. Whatever this place is, whatever it's become, it's trying to mess with us. We need to find out what's going on, and the church might be our best shot. Maybe someone's there, someone who can help us." Jake frowned but didn't argue. Despite the fear gnawing at him, the church was the only place in town that still seemed to be alive. Even the diner, with its strange figure, had felt like a remnant of the past. But the bell, ringing steadily from the church, felt deliberate, purposeful. "Let's go, then," he said, his voice tense. "But we stick together, no matter what. Got it?" The others nodded in agreement, and together they started down the deserted street toward the church. The fading light of the evening cast long shadows that stretched across the road, distorting the familiar landmarks into something alien. Every building they passed seemed to loom higher, its windows dark and hollow like the eyes of something long dead. As they walked, the whispers returned, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder with each step. The voices weren't coming from any one direction. They seemed to seep from the very walls of the town, rising from the cracked pavement and crumbling storefronts. "Do you hear that?" Kara asked, her voice trembling. Jake nodded. "It's the same as before. The whispers, like they are watching us." "They are not just watching," Liz said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "They're speaking. I can almost make out the words." Evan stopped suddenly, grabbing Liz's arm. "Don't listen to them. Whatever this is, it's trying to get inside our heads." Liz looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm not trying to, but it's hard not to. They are saying something about us." Before anyone could respond, the church loomed ahead of them, its crooked steeple casting a jagged shadow across the ground. The bell tolled again, louder now, as if welcoming them. The large wooden doors at the front of the building stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Kara shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't like this. I don't like any of this." Liz swallowed hard, steeling herself. "We don't have a choice. If there's any chance of getting answers, it's in there." They approached the doors cautiously, the weight of the silence pressing down on them as they crossed the threshold into the dim interior of the church. Inside, the air was thick and musty, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. The pews were empty, and the altar at the far end of the room was draped in a tattered cloth. The bell continued to ring from somewhere high above, but there was no sign of movement, no indication of who or what was responsible for the sound. "This place hasn't been used in years," Jake muttered, his eyes scanning the empty space. "How is that bell still ringing?" As if in response, the whispering grew louder, swirling around them in a chaotic storm of sound. The voices overlapped, their words incomprehensible, but their tone unmistakable. Something was wrong, deeply, terribly wrong. "We should leave," Evan said, his voice barely audible over the din. "We shouldn't be here." But before they could turn to go, the doors behind them slammed shut with a deafening crash, plunging the room into darkness. "Jesus!" Jake shouted, stumbling backward. "What the hell?" The whispering intensified, filling the air with a suffocating presence. It was no longer just background noise, it was everywhere, pressing in on them from all sides. The shadows in the room seemed to move of their own accord, swirling like black smoke as they closed in around the group. "Liz, what's happening?" Kara cried, clutching Liz's arm. "I don't know," Liz shouted over the noise, panic rising in her chest. "But we need to find a way out, now." Jake ran toward the doors, throwing his weight against them, but they didn't budge. It was as though they had been sealed shut by some invisible force. "We're trapped," Jake yelled, banging on the heavy wooden doors. "We're trapped in here." Suddenly, a low, rumbling voice broke through the cacophony of whispers, deep and ancient. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You should not have returned." The group froze, terror gripping their hearts. The voice was unlike anything they had ever heard, inhuman, cold, and filled with malice. "You belong to the Hollow now." The shadows around them surged, swirling faster, coalescing into dark shapes that moved with terrifying speed. The figures in the darkness had no faces, no features, just a vague outline of human forms, shifting and writhing in the gloom. "We need to move," Evan shouted, grabbing Kara's hand as they bolted toward the side of the church, searching for another way out. But the figures in the shadows moved faster, blocking their path at every turn, herding them back toward the center of the room. The air grew colder, biting at their skin, and the walls seemed to close in on them, warping and distorting as if the very building was alive. The voice spoke again, its tone mocking. "There is no escape." Liz, her heart pounding in her chest, grabbed Jake's arm. "There has to be a way out. There has to be." But as they stood there, surrounded by the dark, shifting figures, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Barrow's Hollow wasn't just abandoned, it was something far worse, something beyond their understanding, and now it had them. "Why is this happening?" Kara whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "Why us?" The voice answered, cold and cruel. You were always meant to return. The hollow never forgets. The shadows closed in, their forms growing more solid, more real. The whispers became a deafening roar, filling their minds with fear and confusion. Liz felt the cold tendrils of darkness brush against her skin, and for the first time, she understood. Barrows Hollow wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a trap, and now it had claimed them. With a final, echoing toll of the bell, the darkness swallowed them whole. Darkness enveloped Liz, pressing in from all sides, suffocating her senses. The roar of the whispers had faded, leaving only an eerie, oppressive silence. She reached out blindly, her fingers grasping at nothing, desperately searching for her friend in the void. Panic clawed at her throat as she struggled to breathe, to move, to think. Jake, Evan, Kara. Her voice echoed in the emptiness, swallowed almost immediately by the blackness surrounding her. There was no answer. Lizzie's heart raced, pounding in her ears as she forced herself to take a shaky step forward. The ground beneath her felt wrong, soft, unstable, like walking on a shifting surface that wasn't quite solid. She didn't know where she was or what had happened, but she couldn't stay here. She had to find her friends, had to escape this nightmare. As she moved, the darkness seemed to pulse around her, shifting and warping like it was alive. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, twisting into vague, humanoid shapes before dissolving back into the void. She felt their presence more than saw them. Something was watching her, waiting. Suddenly, a faint glimmer of light appeared in the distance, a tiny pinprick of brightness in the overwhelming blackness. Lizzie's breath caught in her throat, hope surging through her chest. Jake, Kara, she called out again, her voice trembling. Evan, I see something. Still no response, but the light didn't fade. It seemed to beckon her forward, a fragile beacon of hope in the endless dark. Liz started walking faster, her legs shaking as she pushed herself toward the light. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was growing thicker, trying to hold her back. The whispers began to creep back into her mind, faint at first, but growing louder with every step. Don't go. It's not real. You can't leave. Liz gritted her teeth, ignoring the voices as best she could. She had to keep moving. She couldn't let the whispers control her. As she drew closer, the light grew brighter, revealing the outline of a door, a small, weathered wooden door standing impossibly in the void. There was no wall around it, no building to support it, just the door, floating in the midst of nothingness. The light seemed to radiate from behind it, casting long shadows across the strange, shifting ground. Liz hesitated, her hand hovering over the door's rusted handle. The whispers had grown louder now, urgent and angry. Don't open it. It's a trap. There is no escape. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the handle, and for a moment she hesitated. What if the whispers were right? What if opening the door would make things worse? But she couldn't stay here, trapped in the dark, with the shadows closing in around her. There had to be a way out. With a deep breath, Liz grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. Blinding light flooded her vision, forcing her to shield her eyes as she stumbled through the doorway. The air around her changed immediately. Gone was the oppressive darkness, replaced by a cold, biting wind that whipped through her hair and sent chills down her spine. When her vision finally adjusted, Liz found herself standing outside, in the center of Barrows Hollow. The town looked almost normal again, bathed in the dim, gray light of early morning. The empty streets stretched out before her, silent and still. But there was something off about the place, something that made her skin crawl. The town was empty, truly, completely empty, not just of people, but of everything. The cars, the signs, even the debris that had once cluttered the streets were gone. It was like Barrows Hollow had been wiped clean, stripped down to its bare bones. The buildings stood like hollow shells, their windows dark and vacant, their doors hanging open as if beckoning her inside. Liz. The sound of her name broke the eerie silence, and Liz spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. Evan was running toward her, his face pale and streaked with dirt, but he was alive. Evan, she cried, relief flooding her as she ran to meet him. Thank God, you're okay. Evan grabbed her shoulders, his eyes wide with fear. We have to go, Liz. We have to get out of here, now. Where are the others? She asked, scanning the empty street behind him. Where's Jake? And Kara? Evan shook his head, his voice tight. I don't know. I got separated from them when everything went dark. I've been looking for you, looking for anyone, for hours. Lizzie's stomach twisted with fear. We need to find them. We can't leave without them. Evan glanced around nervously, his fingers tightening on her arm. Liz, this place, it's not safe. It's like it's alive. The longer we stay, the worse it gets. We need to leave before it's too late. But the road, Liz started to protest, but Evan cut her off. There is no road, not anymore, he said, his voice low. I went to the edge of town. It's gone. Everything outside the town is gone. It's just nothing. Liz stared at him, her mind reeling. What do you mean, nothing? I mean, there's nothing, Liz. No trees, no sky, no ground. It's like the world just stops. The weight of his words settled over her like a cold fog. If the road was gone, if there was no way out, then they were trapped, completely, utterly trapped. But before she could respond, a scream pierced the air, sharp and terrified. Liz's blood ran cold. That was Kara, she gasped, turning toward the sound. Without waiting for Evan, she bolted down the street, her heart pounding in her chest. The scream had come from the direction of the old diner, the same diner where they had seen the strange figure the day before. As Liz rounded the corner, she skidded to a halt. Kara was there, standing in the middle of the street, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was staring at the diner, her eyes wide with horror. "Kara," Liz shouted, rushing to her side. "What happened? Where's Jake?" Kara didn't answer. She just stood there, shaking, her gaze locked on the diner's window. Liz followed her gaze, her breath catching in her throat. Jake was inside the diner, but he wasn't alone. The figure they had seen before, the woman, was standing next to him. Her back was to the window, but Liz could see her arm draped over Jake's shoulder, pulling him close. He wasn't resisting. He stood there, frozen, his face slack and expressionless, as if he were in some kind of trance. "No," Liz whispered, horror creeping through her veins. "No, no, no." Evan caught up to them, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "What the hell is happening? We have to get him out of there," Liz cried, starting toward the diner, but Kara grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Don't," Kara whispered, her voice trembling. "It's too late. She's taken him." Liz stared at Kara, her heart pounding. "What do you mean? We can still save him." "No," Kara said, shaking her head. "She's taken him. He's gone." The woman in the diner turned slowly, her face hidden in shadow, but Liz could feel the weight of her gaze. There was something ancient and malevolent in those eyes, something that didn't belong in their world. And Jake was lost to it, lost to her. The whispers returned, louder now, filling Liz's head with a suffocating roar. "The hollow never lets go." Liz's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her heart breaking as she watched Jake disappear into the darkness of the diner, swallowed whole by the thing that had claimed him. The town was alive, and it had chosen them. There was no escape. There never had been. The weight of Liz's realization hung in the air, a suffocating heaviness that pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Jake was gone, lost to the malevolent force that had claimed Barrow's Hollow. And now, as she stood frozen, staring at the diner where her friend had disappeared, Liz felt the full weight of her helplessness. Beside her, Kara trembled, still clutching her arm, while Evan stood a few feet away, his wide, panicked eyes locked on the diner. The whispers were back, louder now, curling through the cold, empty streets like invisible tendrils, pressing against their skin, and filling their minds with dread. "We have to go," Evan said, his voice strained, as though he was struggling to keep control. "We have to get out of here, Liz. We can't stay." Liz shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "Jake, we can't just leave him. We can't leave him behind." "Liz," Kara's voice was soft, broken. "He's gone. You saw what happened. That thing, it's taken him. If we go after him, we'll be next. The town, it's hungry. It's feeding on us." A chill ran down Liz's spine at Kara's words. The town was feeding on them. She looked around at the empty streets, the dark, looming buildings, and the dense silence that had replaced the familiar buzz of life in Barrow's Hollow. The town itself felt alive, as though it were watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Evan was pacing now, his hands gripping the sides of his head as he muttered under his breath. "This can't be happening. This isn't real. We're just imagining this. There's no way a whole town can disappear like this." But it wasn't just the town that had disappeared. It was more than that. Barrow's Hollow was no longer the place they had grown up in. It had transformed into something dark, twisted, and ancient, something that had been waiting for them to return. Liz took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. "We can't panic. We need to think. There has to be a way out." "We tried everything," Evan snapped, his voice edging with hysteria. "The road is gone. The woods are gone. The whole world outside of this town is gone. We're stuck, Liz. There's no way out." Kara's sobs broke the tension, and she sank to her knees, covering her face with her hands. "We should never have come back. We should never have come back." Liz knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around Kara, though the comfort felt hollow. "We didn't know," she whispered, though the words felt meaningless. None of them had known what waited for them in Barrow's Hollow, and now they were paying the price. But as Liz held her sobbing friend, her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what had happened since they had arrived. The whispers, the strange figure in the diner, the way the town had gradually dissolved into an empty, hollow shell, all of it pointed to something larger, something older than the town itself, something that had been waiting for them. The hollow never lets go, Liz whispered, repeating the words that had echoed in her mind since the whispers had begun. The phrase wasn't just a warning, it was a clue. There was a reason the town had lured them back, a reason why it had claimed Jake, and why it was slowly closing in on them. Liz stood up, determination hardening in her chest. "We're missing something." Kara looked up at her, tear-streaked and desperate. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," Liz said, pacing as her thoughts raced. "This town, it's not just feeding on us. It's playing with us. It's been toying with us since we got here. The road disappearing, the strange figure in the diner, Jake being taken, it's all part of some sick game." Evan stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Liz. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the town doesn't just want to trap us. It wants to use us. But there's a reason why it's taking us one by one. It's waiting for something." Kara shuddered. What could it be waiting for? Lizzie's gaze drifted to the diner, where Jake had disappeared. "It's waiting for us to give up, to accept that there's no way out. That's when it strikes, when we lose hope. That's what happened to Jake." Evan frowned. "So, what do we do? How do we fight something we can't even see?" Liz took a deep breath, her mind racing. "We don't fight it. We don't play by its rules. The town is feeding off our fear, off our belief that we're trapped. But if we stop giving it what it wants, if we stop being afraid, then maybe, just maybe, we can break free." Evan looked skeptical. "And how do we do that?" "We change the game," Liz said, a new determination sparking in her eyes. "We stop running, we stop hiding, and we confront whatever it is that's been pulling the strings." Kara's voice trembled. "But what if it's too late? What if we can't win?" Lizzie's stomach twisted with fear, but she forced herself to stand tall. "We have to try. If we don't, we're already lost." The bell in the old church rang out once more, the deep, haunting sound reverberating through the empty streets. It was a reminder, a summons. Liz turned to Evan and Kara. "The church, that's where we need to go. That's where it all started, and that's where we'll find our answers." Evan hesitated, glancing toward the towering structure at the end of Main Street. "Are you sure?" "No," Liz admitted, her heart pounding. "But it's the only lead we've got." Without another word, they started toward the church, the whispers growing louder as they approached. The building loomed over them, its crooked steeple casting long shadows across the deserted street. The front doors were slightly ajar, just as they had been before, as though the church itself was waiting for them. As they stepped inside, the familiar scent of dust and decay greeted them. The interior of the church bathed in dim, gray light. The pews were empty, the altar draped in the same tattered cloth. But this time, there was something different. A figure stood at the far end of the room, facing the altar. It was Jake. Lizzie's heart leapt into her throat as she ran toward him, but Evan grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Wait," he hissed. "Look." Jake was standing unnaturally still, his back to them, his arms limp at his sides. There was something wrong about the way he stood, something unnatural in the rigidness of his posture. "Jake," Liz called out, her voice trembling. "Jake, is that you?" Slowly, Jake turned to face them, but the sight that greeted them was not their friend. His eyes were empty, hollow, like black pits that stared through them. His face was pale and expressionless, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, but the voice that came out of his mouth wasn't Jake's. It was cold, hollow, and filled with malice. "Jake," Liz whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "What happened to you?" The figure that had once been Jake tilted its head, the smile never leaving its face. The hollow never lets go. Suddenly, the church began to tremble, the walls warping and twisting as the shadows swirled around them. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Evan and Kara grabbed Lizzie's arms, pulling her back toward the doors, but the figure that had been Jake stepped forward, its eyes locked on hers. "You belong to the hollow now," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. Lizzie's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her gaze never leaving the thing that had taken her friend. But even as the darkness closed in around them, she refused to give in to the fear. "No," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "We don't belong to you." With a surge of determination, Liz yanked open the doors, and the three of them ran into the street, the whispers fading behind them. The town was still empty, still cold, but something had changed. The oppressive weight that had been crushing them since their arrival had lifted, if only slightly. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of town, where the road had once been. To their shock, the road was back, stretching out into the distance like a lifeline. Lise turned to Evan and Kara, her breath coming in ragged gasps. We need to leave. Now. Without another word, they sprinted toward the road, their feet pounding against the pavement as the town of Barrows Hollow faded behind them. They didn't stop until they were miles away, far beyond the reach of the whispers. But even as they escaped the town's clutches, Lise knew that Barrows Hollow was not finished with them. The Hollow never lets go.